Thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I just want to do a shout out to everybody in the overflow room. So let's hear it for them. Come on. They paid just as much as you did. So.
Okay.
Oh, I want to thank Alessandra because, as some of you may know, she is a last-minute pinch hitter for Maureen Dowd, who could not be here. And so let's hear it for Alessandra Stanley, who is a superstar in her own right.
In her own mind. Yes.
In her own mind.
I am a journalist, and I am the co-editor of a digital publication called Airmail, about which you'll hear constantly. But it's a great pleasure to be here. And I've known Andy for quite a while. And this is a great honor. So let's just start immediately with the book, Profiles in Ignorance. And those of you who haven't read it yet, he traces the decline of intelligence in political candidates from Dan Quayle to Sarah Palin, George W., and of course Trump.
You missed the granddaddy of them all. There you go again.
Oh, Reagan, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Ronald Reagan, of course.
Reagan. He started it all. But you didn't say which of those was the worst or the most ignorant.
Well, first of all, let's define our terms a little bit. Like, I am actually careful about using terms like idiotic or moronic or cretinous, even though they're great fucking words. I mean, let's face it, they're very useful. But on the internet now, people call you an idiot if they disagree with you. I mean, that's just par for the course. And so I try to avoid, and I say this in the introduction of the book, I am not a neurologist. I hate to drop a bomb on you like that, but I'm not really qualified to talk about people's brain capacity or how cogent they are or how intelligent they are. I'm only qualified to say how little they know. And that's really the definition of ignorance is knowing nothing. And so I was curious when I got into this project to see where that began, and it's always been a problem in politics in general and in American politics. But my starting point in the book was 1966, because that was the year that Ronald Reagan ran for governor of California. And in terms of ignorance, like who is the most ignorant, it's interesting. I mean, now we have a situation where we have two kinds of ignorance in politics. We have real ignorance and we have performative ignorance, okay? And the problem with performative ignorance is that after a certain point, it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. So
who do you mean?
So real ignorance. Donald Trump is genuinely ignorant. He doesn't know many things. He doesn't know, for example, that Frederick Douglass is not still alive. I think that's a very basic piece of knowledge that we should have. When he was president, he had a meeting with some members of some prime ministers, actually, and presidents of the Baltic states, and started excoriating them for starting the war in the Balkans in the 90s. And he seemed completely unaware of what the Balkans were, which is interesting because his wife is actually from the Balkans. She is Slovenian, which suggests that maybe he doesn't talk to his wife as much as, say, most people do. So maybe, he knows where Stormy Daniels is from. I mean, I don't know. So he is genuinely ignorant. So when he says things that are stupid or, says, a good way to cure coronavirus is by drinking bleach, it's because he really believes that to be true. His ignorance is completely honest and sincere. And I also put in that category some of his acolytes like, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, Marjorie Taylor Greene thinks that I have a space laser. because again, I am Jewish. I'm of the Jewish persuasion, and she thinks that Jews have space lasers that we use to, like, start wildfires in California and do stuff like that. And I am so flattered that she thinks I could ever operate a space laser. I can barely mute myself on Zoom, and you laugh, but Zoom is harder to work than you would think. I mean, if Jeff Toobin knew how to use Zoom, he'd still be on CNN. I mean, he would be. So she, like Trump, her ignorance is completely sincere. Lauren Boebert's is completely sincere. Now, I want to talk about a few people whose ignorance is performative. So this is what's, when I talk about in this book the 3 stages of ignorance, and we can discuss that in a bit if you want. But the stage we're in now is a stage I call the celebration stage of ignorance, where smart politicians are pretending to be stupid to get votes. And so some of these people who are performatively ignorant are Ron DeSantis, who went to Harvard and Yale, okay? Not that everyone who went to Harvard and Yale are smart, but
We call it the Tulane of the North.
Exactly. Exactly. With apologies to Tulane, I should add. But he was exposed to a lot of smart stuff. He's the kind of guy who was like, Ron DeSantis was spreading so much misinformation about COVID that he was banned from YouTube. Now, I don't know if you've been on YouTube lately, but to get banned from YouTube, I mean, that really takes some doing. And meanwhile, he was like saying all this stuff about, mask mandates and vaccines and all this stuff. Meanwhile, he was quietly getting his own children vaccinated, okay? So that is performative ignorance. That's when you're pretending to be stupider than you are because you think that that is going to appeal to your base. Another person who's really big into performative ignorance is Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz, Princeton graduate, he wants us to believe that the most important issue facing America today is the gender of Mr. Potato Head. That is clearly in the top 5, but it is not the most important issue. So I've got to say something. I actually find these purveyors of performative ignorance to be far more reprehensible than the genuinely, sincerely ignorant, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Because they are hoaxers and tricksters and scam artists, and they also are insulting to America because they think that the American people want a stupid candidate. And so that I actually put them, on the moral scale, I put them far lower than I put somebody who is genuinely, sincerely ignorant.
Okay, so do you have any judgment between people who had the opportunity to be well-informed, like George W. Bush, like Dan Quayle, versus Sarah Palin, who had fewer advantages as a child? I mean,
No, that's a really good point. Like, it's funny that you bring up Dan Quayle and George W. Bush as kind of a pair, and the two of them are so similar. And I actually have in the book a quiz called Quayle or Bush, where I ask the reader I give some facts about these people, and you have to decide who is who. And the answer to every question is both, because they are pretty much the same person. They're like 3rd generation of family wealth. They're both these white members of the elite. They were even in the same fraternity. They were in the DKE fraternity, and Dan Quayle was at DePauw and Bush was at Yale. But I do, it's a really interesting point because, I put them at a, I think that they both squandered opportunities to learn because they were both at good schools and had every academic advantage. And somebody like Sarah Palin Now, she was exposed to schools too, because she actually attended 6 different colleges. She was like, it was like the Where's Waldo of education. Like, she just kept on moving around. But yeah, I mean, she was not, she did not have, in a way, Sarah Palin, is kind of an impressive story how far she went with what she had, because she started in politics at the age of like 28. I think she became mayor of Wasilla, and she went pretty far. If only anything that she had to offer had been good, she would have actually been a great American success story. But they all, ranking ignorance is a tough thing, because everybody in the book, to make it into the book, you had to be pretty ignorant. And I actually, the one person I really think deserves our attention as Americans is Ronald Reagan, because he is the one who really got this whole party started. Because Ronald Reagan's introduction to politics was really interesting, I thought. Like, and I just spent a lot of time researching this, that when he was first introduced as a political candidate, he was considered a joke, because he was this Hollywood actor whose career had never been fantastic, but was already, it was very much in decline by 1966. He'd even, like, his TV career was already kind of over. And one of the true stories in the book was that Jack Warner, the studio mogul, studio head, was told that Ronald Reagan was considering running for governor, and his reaction was, "Ronnie for governor? No. Jimmy Stewart for governor, Ronnie for best friend." And that was kind of gives you a sense of sort of where he stood. And the reason why he was chosen by this group of very wealthy Republican industrialists in California who wanted to get the State House back into the Republican column. They had seen what had happened in the 1960 televised presidential debates, which was that John F. Kennedy, who was so much better looking and so much better on TV, really cleaned Richard Nixon's clock on television. But people who had listened to that debate on the radio actually thought Nixon had won. So that was kind of like a real Sputnik moment, if you will, where people realized, oh shit, like TV is going to be really important. So these millionaires decide to kind of reverse engineer the problem. Rather than finding somebody who was really knowledgeable and training them how to be good on television, they said, let's find somebody who's really good on TV, and then we'll kind of just like pour knowledge into him, sort of like a beer funnel, and we'll give him enough sound bites that he'll come across as not ignorant. He'll come across as informed. And Ronald Reagan was their man. So they trained him to do this. He wound up winning the race by 1 million votes, which was a huge amount. The only problem was he didn't know shit. So he was governor of California and then became president of the United States. He never knew anything. I'll give you some examples of some things that Ronald Reagan didn't know. Ronald Reagan did not know that South America was composed of different countries. He didn't know that until he visited South America as president of the United States. He didn't know that trees actually produced oxygen and were good for us. He thought that trees produced more pollution than cars. He said that they were the biggest killers that we had, trees. And so he actually did, when he was running for president in 1980, he did an appearance at Claremont College in California, and some students tacked a sign to a tree that said, "Chop me down before I kill again."
Okay. All right. What about Democrats, though? I mean, are there Democrats who thrive on ignorance, or traffic in it?
I mean, Democrats have their own set of problems, which I discuss in the book pretty thoroughly. I mean, there are Democrats, I would say there are Democrats who, and I would put them in a subset of Democrats, which is Democrats who are lawyers, who think that they're so smart they can talk their way out of anything. It's like they say it depends on what the meaning of the word is. For example, that would be my example of like people who are so overeducated that they become ignorant and sort of create their own problems their own way. Another great example of that is, I mean, it's a lot of these, it's like John Edwards is another great example of that, Andrew Cuomo. These guys also seem to have another problem in common. They have sort of what I would say, how can I put it? I could put it as delicately as possible. I would say they have a wandering penis issue, which is they just can't keep it in the pants. But I mean, you're not very smart if you're like smoking crack on camera, like Marion Barry did, or if you're like, you know, Governor Rod Blagojevich and you're selling a Senate seat on the phone, like you're a telemarketer, you know. So there are all kinds of, I mean, in the book I talk about these Democrats. The differentiation I make is the Democrats have never had a really calculated strategy to weaponize ignorance. They have dumbed down their message. Right. Both Clinton and Barack Obama dumbed down their message in order to win. Barack Obama very famously said to a reporter in Reno that he thought the most transformative president in recent memory was Ronald Reagan. And I mean, that is really a horrifying statement because he really looked to Ronald Reagan's message of hope, which was a big Ronald Reagan message, and he really ripped that off. Bill Clinton loved Ronald Reagan so much that when he was president, every time Bill Clinton had to make a major speech, like at the 50th anniversary of Normandy, for example, he was like, what did Ronald Reagan say at the 40th anniversary? So he would actually send an aide to the Ronald Reagan Museum in California to check out a video of Ronald Reagan so then he could lift that speech. Like, the Reagan Library for Clinton became like Blockbuster Video. I mean, it was just like, so here you've got two of the most educated presidents, Democratic presidents, or presidents, period. I mean, you know, Bill Clinton was, you know, went to Georgetown, he went to Yale Law School, he went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. Barack Obama is so smart. He's, you know, he is such an eloquent, unbelievable speaker of the English language, which is especially impressive when you consider he wasn't even born here. You know, he somehow learned our customs and our ways. But you know, you have these two guys who are at the absolute top 1% of their class, the most brilliant guys, and who did they look to like shape their message and their delivery of that message but Ronald Reagan? So that tells you that there's something dreadfully wrong, which is that the ignorance and the party of ignorance is kind of leading the way. So although the book focuses on Republicans, it does certainly talk about the ill effect of this general trend towards ignorance in politics and how it's impacted both parties. And also, let's not forget the independents. Let's not forget Ross Perot and Jesse Ventura. I mean, these are guys who really said, you know, you don't want somebody who's ever run anything in government to be running the government. It's so much better to find somebody who's just been wrestling. That, you know, I mean, look, government's fake and wrestling's fake. It's going to work out. But you know, those guys started doing this thing called, in 1992 was when Ross Perot started, but by 96, he had started this thing called the Reform Party, and Jesse Ventura ran as governor of Minnesota under the Reform Party banner. And in the year 2000, they were very close to nominating somebody for the Reform Party by the name of Donald J. Trump. And he came very close to accepting that coveted nomination. Instead, it went to Pat Buchanan, and the less said about him, the better.
You are a professional humorist, I would say, right? A writer and humorist, and you write a wonderful column for The New Yorker. I was just wondering, though, in this era where we talk about censorship on the left, you know, and that you can't say, comedians complain that there's very little they can say because people get triggered or they're, you know, angry or whatever, that very few subjects are allowed anymore. There's too many taboos. Do you find that? I mean, did the New Yorker ever say, Andy, we can't run this?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I feel that now, I will answer that question, I'll answer that directly in a moment, but I feel like this whole issue of like what's woke and what's not woke, it's like this is just being weaponized by the right wing. This is not a real thing. It's just not. I mean, yeah, people are sensitive. People have always been sensitive about comedy, and comedians have always gotten in trouble. I mean, Mark Twain got in trouble. Jonathan Swift got in trouble. This is not a new thing. When I hear this stuff about like woke and left-wing censorship, I think that's mainly something that people like Ron DeSantis is weaponizing because they think there's votes. In the UK, there's this terrible person named Suella Braverman, who's the Home Secretary in the government, and she coined this phrase, which said, the Guardian reading, tofu eating wokerati. And she's a horrible person, but that's a great fucking turn of phrase. I love it. I love that. It's just because it's so over the top. It's so ridiculous, and it's so clearly pandering, you know? And so I turned on the TV the other day. I think it was MSNBC, and I don't know if we probably have some MSNBC viewers here. MSNBC, I don't usually watch because to me, it's kind of Fox for vegans. It's kind of like the same format, but it's just we happen to agree with it, you know. So it's, but it's enjoyable. I like. They also have, by the way, the worst slogan of any major network ever. Their slogan was "Lean Forward," which is also the slogan of the rectal exam. You know? I mean, it's like.
No. Okay.
I mean, I have to express this. I mean, what was the meeting like where they decided that lean forward was, I mean, what was their second choice? Was it like, you might feel some pressure? I mean, I don't know. Anyway, but I digress. But to answer your question, was there ever anything that the New Yorker wouldn't let me say? Yes. The New Yorker, on the whole, I would say, I write about 100, 150 columns a year, and almost all of them get through. You know, every now and then there'll be like some reason why they can't do something. There was a moment very mysteriously where they asked me not to write anything about North Korea. And I thought, well, that's weird. You know, that's like a strangely specific request. And it turned out that they were actually on the verge of getting one of their reporters into North Korea. And they didn't want anything to screw it up. And I just pictured, you know, Kim Jong-un with a furrowed brow saying, "Fuck you, Borowitz. We're not, Evan Osnos is not getting in, does it?" It's the last straw. But the one time, so that wasn't really censorship. That wasn't really the wokerati. The one time that there was some sensitivity was there was my editor at the website, a very lovely man who's now moved on to greater things. But after Trump was installed as president, I was writing something about Trump supporters, and in the column I referred to Trump supporters as idiots. You know, so I don't use that term anymore, but at the time I wanted to use that term. And my editor said, "Andy, we can't call Trump supporters idiots." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "We don't want the New Yorker to appear elitist." And I was like, you know, I think once a magazine has decided that its mascot is going to be a guy with a top hat and a monocle, I think the ship has kind of sailed on the whole elitist thing. I mean, like, who do they think their readers are? Like, Kid Rock is going to cancel his subscription. It's like, Kid Rock is like, I usually enjoy the New Yorker for their book reviews and their short fiction, but this has gone too far. Kid Rock puts on his top hat and monocle and storms off. So that was a real thing. That really happened.
I love that. Okay, you did college humor. You were on the Lampoon.
Mm-hmm.
Is it different now? Have you ever looked at a college? I mean, there was. I'm just wondering what kids are allowed to do in sort of satire on campuses, because I think that they hold themselves to a different standard. When you were at Tulane of the North, the whole point was to shock and provoke people. That was the idea of comedy still, but it's not anymore, is it?
When I was on the Lampoon, I would have to say the whole point was to get drunk. I mean, honestly, like I don't want to dignify what we did with this kind of literary analysis, because really we were college kids and we were dumb and we were mainly just getting drunk and watching TV. And then a lot of us wound up becoming TV writers. So it worked out well. And a lot of us also wound up becoming drunks. So it was our training was very good. We didn't really, honestly, we did not think about offending people, or we didn't self-edit very much. We had kind of a good foil in college, which was the Harvard Crimson, because the Harvard Crimson was definitely the Guardian reading, tofu eating wokerati. And they were always very politically correct. And so that was kind of fun. Like, we would do a parody of the Crimson, where we'd find out a day that the Crimson wasn't publishing, and we would then produce a newspaper that looked exactly like the Crimson, but it was full of fake news, and then we would just distribute that around campus. And that was the most fun we ever had, because it was such a great format to write in. And now, fast forward decades later, that is still my job. I mean, that is what I do at the New Yorker. So that, I think that the term that applies, I think, is arrested development. I think I have not matured as a human in any way. But we really didn't think about, I'm sure we did offend people, but I think in order to offend people, students would have first had to actually read the Lampoon, which I'm pretty sure they didn't. So I think our impact was very little. Now, I actually had a really lovely, I live in Hanover, New Hampshire now, which is where Dartmouth College is, and I had a meeting with the staff of the Dartmouth humor magazine. They invited me over, and they were talking about some of this stuff. And actually, one of the problems now, which we never had to contend with, was, now there's unfortunately social media. So it's not so much the humor magazine that deals with it. I think, again, the newspaper, the Dartmouth, as it's called, like if somebody writes, I think somebody wrote an editorial talking about the discrimination she faced as like a rich white student at Dartmouth. And it's the kind of thing that only like a 21-year-old mind would actually commit to print and think, this is gonna go really well. And I think she got really ripped. And then at that point, I sort of said, well, wait a minute, is that really fair? That's like, when you're 21, isn't that the time that we're allowed to make mistakes? I understand, like, if somebody my age, or, some comedian who, or a columnist, or somebody whose brain has fully developed. I think they're now saying brains do not fully develop until after 25. I would say, probably a little bit later than that, based on my observation of people. But I think, like, the whole point of being in college is to fuck up, right? That's the time that you're supposed to make mistakes and figure out how to be a person in the world. And now there's this unfortunate social media nightmare that just, if you make one mistake on Twitter, I think if you're me and I say something really offensive on Twitter, I quit Twitter, so there's a little danger of that. But if let's say Elon Musk had never bought Twitter and I were still on Twitter, and I said something dumb, then I deserve to get ripped and then face the consequence. But if you're a 21-year-old who's very earnestly writing about the difficulties of being wealthy at Dartmouth, you should get a free pass, I think. Actually am in favor of getting rid of social media entirely. I think we should get rid of all of it. I think on YouTube, we should get rid of everything on YouTube except makeup tutorials. I mean, if you think about it, like, if we just, every time we went on YouTube, we just learned how to apply makeup better, we would not be full of all this hatred that we're learning from all these conspiracy theories, and we'd look so much better. I mean, I think if we started here in Tulane and started that as a movement, I don't think we'd be stoppable. I really don't. I think we could make that happen.
You mentioned television, and of course, among the many things you did was The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
That's true. That's true.
With, not with Chris Rock, with Will Smith.
The other guy.
Yeah. Is television comedy much different than that show? And were there things that you did on that show that you wouldn't be able to do now?
You know, it's interesting. Like, I think that show, it started in 1990, so we're talking 33 years ago. It's a long time ago. And, I was in LA, and I was writing about, a world that I really knew very little about because, nowadays, and there actually has been a reboot of the show called Bel-Air that's on Peacock, and it's, there are some white writers involved in the show, but it's mainly run and written and show run by African Americans. And in the 90s, in a perfect world, that would have been the case then. As a matter of fact, NBC first went to the Hudlin brothers, who are these two very talented writer-directors who did the movie House Party, and they're African Americans, and they would have been the ideal choice to do that show. And unfortunately, they had better things to do, so they didn't do it, and so it fell to me. And because I was white and clearly not qualified to write about the black experience, what I immediately did was, I sort of acted like a journalist. I hired African American writers, directors, and of course the cast was all African American, and I just put myself in a position of what I call, and I talk about it in the book a little bit too, intellectual humility, which is just acknowledging that you're ignorant. And that's where learning starts, right? You have to, that as a reporter, you have to start by assuming you know nothing. And so I would ask the people on the show to educate me. And I had a really interesting experience because one day I was talking to Will Smith and some of the other guys. He had a friend named Benny Richburg, who is African American, who we grew up with in Philadelphia. And they were all telling stories about the many times that they were stopped by white policemen for driving cars, which is something one should be allowed to do in America. But Will Smith, being a very successful young rapper who had access to all the money, he had a Mercedes-Benz, who was always getting stopped, and the police were always assuming that it was a stolen vehicle. So I thought, well, that would make a really good episode of the show, wouldn't it? So we did an episode called Mistaken Identity, which was all about him driving his uncle's car out to Palm Springs, and he and his cousin Carlton getting arrested. And Carlton had grown up in Bel-Air, so he was very sheltered, had never had this experience before, and he thought it had to be some kind of kooky misunderstanding. And he was totally a believer in the police, and everything they did was right. And Will, of course, knew all the script that was going to happen. He said, okay, they're going to tell us to get out of the car, and the cop was like, get out of the car, And he just knew everything that was coming. So weirdly enough, because TV was not in 1990 dealing with a lot of this stuff, this actually was a couple of years before the Rodney King incident and the race riots in LA. Weirdly, it was ahead of its time. And that's not a boast, that's just a fact. We were doing a show about an experience that television being run pretty much exclusively by white executives at that point and it still is to a great extent. They just had really underserved that audience. And as a result, none of those issues were being covered. So weirdly, like that show is sort of a strange situation where it's a 90s time capsule. The fashions are very dated, which is kind of the fun of it. It's like kids can watch it now, and it's sort of like watching Happy Days. It's like, whoa, that clothes. And those clothes weren't even real when we were doing the show. We had a very talented costume designer, wardrobe designer, who was creating these really extreme sort of Technicolor clothes, and that was always sort of the intent of it being kind of cartoony and over the top. But we were able to deal with all of this stuff that was, at the time, kind of at the vanguard of something because no one else was talking about it. So, I don't think there was anything then. I think probably the one thing that you wouldn't do now is that Will's character was kind of like a sexual braggart. He was always doing these kind of like corny come-on lines to women, which now just would seem so weird, like you wouldn't do them. But I don't think there were things. I don't think there were things that were, that the wokerati would object to now. And it was actually really, one thing that was really cool about the reboot was that the reboot was created or developed by this guy named Morgan Cooper, who is a kid who just grew up watching the show. He's only like in his 30s now. And so he watched the show and he thought, wouldn't it be fun to do on YouTube, do like a video trailer for what a dramatic reboot of that show would be. So it was like he restaged The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as this like gritty drama, and then his trailer was so great, like Peacock said, yeah, let's do that show. So they've now done 2 seasons. So that's a very long way, a long trip down memory lane. But no, I think, I think that there, I think that there, certainly shows where there would be content that wouldn't be acceptable now, but for whatever reason, I don't think there was a lot in that show that you couldn't do now.
I have another bunch of questions, but I have to stop because I think in the audience a lot of people want to ask questions. So,
do we have a microphone? Is that a working microphone?
Does someone have a question that they would like to ask? Or can I just keep going?
I think someone's going to ask a question. Here we go.
I don't get to read your columns a lot, and I'm not a New Yorker subscriber. But I was
Okay,
just
please sit down. No. You can continue. What do you read? I mean, you clearly have something better to read than the New Yorker. Do you find us too elitist? Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Anyway, talking about the performative ignorance, in Louisiana, we kind of have a history of that, but there's one guy in the Senate right now, John Kennedy. Seems like he would be, you could write multiple columns on him. I'm just wondering if you ever did or if you had.
He's got kind of a whole sort of foghorn, leghorn thing going, John Kennedy. Yeah, is he, I mean, I haven't really.
He's a Harvard grad.
Yeah, somebody told me that. Let me make it very clear. Harvard is full of genuinely dumb people too, because there's something called alumni donations and legacies. So, I mean, everyone was really beating up on Lori Loughlin for trying to get her kids in the car. This has been going on at Harvard and all the Ivy League schools for decades. Anytime you see like a gym, that means somebody's fucking moron got into college. That's just the way. That's the way it works. So yeah, John Kennedy, he's definitely, I mean, I've seen him in Senate hearings. I mean, if we wanted to give Americans confidence in their government, the first thing we would do is get these fucking people off TV. Like, every time there are Senate hearings for anything, it's like, how did these people get elected? I would not trust them to heat up a burrito. I mean, they're like and also, like, on both parties, like, if you ever, like, go back and watch the Anita Hill hearings, and you see a certain chairman of the Judiciary Committee, this guy Joe Biden, and whatever happened to that dude? I mean, they were all so dumb. And some of it's performative, and then some of it is just that they all want to act like lawyers, and they want to seem so smart, and they just they should just take all those people. You know what we should do? Just get rid of C-SPAN and replace it with makeup tutorials. Next question.
To combine like current events and TV and like political commentary, do you think a show like South Park would be able to pilot today without backlash?
A show like South Park?
Yes.
Like if it came out now and it weren't already a huge hit? Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I mean, it's hard, it's hard to say, like, I don't know what the inner sanctum of TV executives' offices are like, but those guys are just geniuses. I mean, I don't know how they produced that so quickly and for so many years. I just sort of am in awe of them. I'm not a regular viewer of the show, but I mean, they also created The Book of Mormon, which is a phenomenal musical. So I don't know. I would hope that people would recognize that it was just so funny that it would make it over. But you never know. I mean, we are living in kind of a censoring time. So, sir?
What did you think of the new Chris Rock special?
I gotta say, I loved it. Like, it has gotten such mixed reviews, and I would say mainly negative reviews. The New Yorker hated it.
They did?
Yeah, the New Yorker absolutely ripped it. It's gotten, I checked on like Metacritic the other day, and it was like really mixed. And one thing that's really unfair about the reviews, I mean, there were some great jokes on that show. He was talking about January 6th. I don't know if you saw it, but it's like talking about like these people like climbing over the Capitol building, and he was like saying, that was some weird fucking white Planet of the Apes shit going on there. And it's like, that is the best description of January 6th I've heard. I mean, like, for that alone, I'm in awe of Chris Rock. But, I mean, I think one thing that was really unfair about some of the reviews is that reviewers said, it's not as good as some other things Chris Rock has done.
Yeah.
So it's like Chris Rock is now competing with 90s Chris Rock. That seems so unfair. It's like, let's just be grateful Chris Rock is still doing stuff because he's one of the funniest people on the planet. So I will watch, I don't think it was like C plus Chris Rock, but even if it were, C plus Chris Rock is better than almost anybody else. So I loved it.
Excellent. You know, it's interesting, we haven't talked about Biden. I think this is going to be the last question unless someone has one, because we're running out of time.
Let's hear it for Alessandra, by the way.
Doesn't have to be. Would you like President Biden to have to run for a second term?
Would I like President Biden to have a second term? Yes, but I would like him to take 2004 off and run 2024 off and run like maybe 4 years later. I think it's a very punishing job, and I think he needs like 4 years off, and then when he's 88, he's gonna come roaring back, and he'll be great. One thing I actually like I was not a Joe Biden supporter, I was an Elizabeth Warren supporter, I've gotta say, but one thing I like about Joe Biden now that he's president is the fact that he's so old, he clearly just doesn't give a shit. And so like, the reporter will be saying something like, President Biden, your budget proposal is not realistic. And he's like, oh, go fuck yourself. On that note, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Oh.